Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin did not emerge from the spotlight of public life. He emerged from the calculated, purposeful shadows of the world's most formidable intelligence apparatus. His narrative is not one of charismatic mass movements, inherited political capital, or ideological fervor. It is a meticulously constructed chronicle of patience, cold pragmatism, and a postgraduate education in the mechanics of power, earned within the silent corridors of the Soviet Committee for State Security, the KGB. To comprehend the president who has defined the 21st century geopolitical landscape, one must first decipher the operative. This inaugural chapter traces Putin's evolution from a hardened childhood in post-siege Leningrad through the transformative crucible of KGB training and his formative posting in East Germany. It reveals how the foundational philosophies, operational skills, and uncompromising worldview forged in absolute obscurity would later be deployed to resurrect and redefine a shattered superpower. Vladimir Putin entered the world on October 7, 1952, in a city that was itself a monument to survival, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. The metropolis still bore the horrific, unhealed scars of the 872-day Nazi siege that had ended less than a decade before his birth, a siege that claimed over 1 million lives through starvation, disease, and shelling. He was the third and only surviving child of Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, a wounded veteran of the Great Patriotic War who worked as a foreman in a railcar factory, and Maria Ivanovna Putina, a factory worker who endured the unspeakable horrors of the blockade, losing a young son to diphtheria. The family's home was a kommunalka, communal apartment, at 12 Baskov Lane, a dilapidated pre-revolutionary building where multiple families shared a single kitchen, bathroom, and hallway. Life was a daily exercise in scarcity and negotiation, for hot water, for space, for a moment of privacy, for dignity. The young Vladimir was slight, wiry, and possessed of a simmering intensity. The courtyard of his building, like countless others across the Soviet Union, was a Darwinian microcosm where hierarchy was established through physical and psychological toughness. Here, he internalized his first indelible lesson in power dynamics. Strength, or the convincing projection of it, commands respect and security. Perceived weakness is an invitation for predation. This was not abstract philosophy, it was the survival code of the Leningrad backstreets. His early academic performance was middling, but his trajectory was permanently altered during adolescence by two seemingly disparate influences that converged to shape his destiny: the martial art of judo and the romantic allure of spy fiction. At age 12, he began training in judo under a rigorous coach. For Putin, judo was far more than a sport or a means of self-defense. It was a complete strategic philosophy. It taught him to conserve energy, to assess an opponent's balance and momentum, and to use that adversary's own strength as the instrument of their downfall. Victory was achieved not through superior brute force, but through superior leverage, timing, and tactical patience, principles that would become the cornerstone of his political and geopolitical maneuvers. Parallel to this physical discipline, he developed a fascination with the mythology of Soviet intelligence. He voraciously consumed books and films glorifying state security officers, most notably the popular 1968 television miniseries The Shield and the Sword, which depicted the heroic exploits of a Soviet spy infiltrating the Nazi SS. He was captivated not by communist dogma, but by the archetype, the solitary, supremely competent operative operating deep behind enemy lines, armed with secret knowledge, unwavering loyalty, and the power to alter events from the shadows. This potent combination of physical discipline and romantic ambition crystallized into a singular goal. At the age of 16, in an act of startling audacity, he walked into the local KGB headquarters in Leningrad to inquire about joining. The officer he met did not dismiss the teenager. Instead, he offered a succinct, career-defining piece of advice. "We don't take people who just walk in off the street, but if you really want to work here, get a law degree first." Putin treated this not as a rejection, but as an operational directive. In 1970, with focused determination, he gained admission to the prestigious law faculty of Leningrad State University. His choice of discipline was highly strategic. A law degree was a recognized and respected pathway into the security services. Within the university, he was an outsider among the children of the party nomenklatura and intelligentsia. He maintained a low profile, was not politically active in official youth leagues, and focused intently on his studies. He graduated in 1975 with a thesis entitled "The Most Favored Nation Trading Principle in International Law," a dry, technical subject that stood in stark contrast to the world of clandestine operations awaiting him. His recruitment into the KGB's first chief directorate, the arm responsible for foreign intelligence and espionage, was immediate. He had passed the first filter. What followed was a comprehensive and brutal process of professional and psychological transformation. Putin's training began at the KGB's School 101 in Moscow and continued at the elite Red Banner Institute. This was not merely an education in tradecraft, surveillance, cryptography, codes, recruitment, and sabotage. It was an immersive indoctrination into a specific worldview. He was taught to perceive international relations as a perpetual, zero-sum struggle between states, where notions of friendship and morality were naive distractions. The only constants were national interest and the relentless pursuit of strategic advantage. Trust was a liability, information was the ultimate currency, and compromat, or compromising material, was a more potent weapon than any firearm. The ideal intelligence officer, he learned, was not a flamboyant James Bond, but a gray man, invisible, bureaucratic, patient, and capable of manipulating the levers of power and events without ever leaving a fingerprint. He applied himself with discipline, mastering the German language to a level of fluency that would dictate his first major field assignment. That assignment came in 1985, a period of escalating Cold War tensions under Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. Putin, now a lieutenant colonel, was posted to Dresden in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Superficially, it was a provincial backwater, far from the glamorous espionage hubs of London, Washington, or Geneva. But for a mid-level KGB officer, Dresden was an ideal operational laboratory. His official cover was as a liaison for the Soviet East German Friendship Society. His true mission involved recruiting informants within the scientific and technical communities, gathering political intelligence, and monitoring the growing dissident movements. For 4 years, he observed the brittle, oppressive reality of a Soviet satellite state and the quiet desperation of its populace. Then, in 1989, his world fractured. As the Berlin Wall was breached and peaceful revolutions swept across Eastern Europe, a mobilized crowd in Dresden stormed the local Stasi, East German secret police, headquarters. Emboldened, they then turned toward the unmarked KGB villa. With telephone lines to a paralyzed Moscow dead, Vladimir faced the mob alone. Armed only with a pistol, he stepped outside and delivered a calculated bluff. He declared the building a protected Soviet military site, guarded by armed personnel who had orders to shoot. The guards he invoked did not exist. The Dresden experience imprinted 2 fundamental convictions onto Putin's psyche. First, that revolutions, particularly inspired or exploited by the West, lead inexorably to chaos, lawlessness, and the humiliation of Russian state power. Second, and more personally, that in a moment of existential crisis, the center may not hold. Ultimate responsibility falls to the individual who must project unflinching strength from a position of actual weakness. He returned to Leningrad in 1990 as a decorated officer, but to a homeland that was itself unraveling. The Soviet Union, the empire his service was sworn to protect, was in its death throes. The KGB was despised and fracturing. For a time, he contemplated leaving the security services altogether, even considering driving a taxi to support his young family. Yet the core lesson of his profession was adaptability. The spy, trained to operate in the shadows of a stable superpower, now had to navigate the glaring, chaotic, and lawless daylight of a new Russia, a nation whose vast resources and levers of power were suddenly, violently up for grabs. His next theater of operations was being born out of the ashes of the old one. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not spell the end of Vladimir Putin's career. It provided the ultimate proving ground. As the old state crumbled, a new, wild, and profoundly corrupt system emerged from its ruins, a system perfectly designed for a man with his particular skill set. The 1990s in Russia were an era of bandit capitalism, political paralysis, and national humiliation. This chapter chronicles Putin's meteoric and calculated rise from a disillusioned KGB officer in Leningrad to the most powerful man in the Kremlin. It is the story of how a master of chaos learned to first navigate, then manipulate, and finally conquer the anarchic landscape of post-Soviet Russia, positioning himself as the indispensable solution to the very disorder he understood better than anyone. Putin returned to his hometown of Leningrad, now reverting to its historic name, St. Petersburg, in early 1990, a man without a mission. The KGB was in disgrace, and his expertise seemed obsolete. His first bridge back into civilian life was his former law professor, Anatoly Sobchak, a charismatic reformist who had just been elected chairman of the Leningrad City Council. Sobchak offered Putin a job as his international affairs advisor. This was a critical pivot. Putin leveraged his KGB-honed German language skills and understanding of foreign bureaucracies to attract potential Western investors to the struggling city. He was effective, but more importantly, he was loyal and discreet, two qualities Sobchak desperately needed in the snake pit of local politics. In 1991, as Sobchak became the city's first democratically elected mayor, Putin was placed in charge of the Mayor's Office Committee for External Relations. This bureaucratic title belied his real power. He controlled the city's lucrative licenses for foreign trade, a position that placed him at the very heart of the nexus between politics, business, and emerging organized crime. It was here, in the murky waters of St. Petersburg's early capitalism, that Putin built his essential network, the Siloviki, men of power, and the pragmatic technocrats who would follow him to Moscow. He worked alongside figures like future Deputy Prime Minister Igor Sechin and future head of Russia's railways Vladimir Yakunin. He also formed a crucial symbiotic relationship with a group of young, ambitious entrepreneurs from the city's elite circles, future oligarchs like Vladimir Yakunin, and through connections, the men who would form the core of his financial backbone. His office was accused by city auditors of mismanaging funds from a major food-for-oil barter deal, a scandal that could have ended his career. Putin weathered it, protected by Sobchak's patronage and his own circle of allies. This period taught him the operational mechanics of power in the new Russia. Loyalty networks were paramount, formal rules were malleable, and control over economic flows was the foundation of political control. In 1996, Sobchak lost his mayoral re-election bid. True to his code of personal loyalty, a trait he valued above all, Putin resigned, refusing to serve the new administration. He was effectively unemployed. Yet his reputation for competence, discretion, and fierce loyalty had reached Moscow. In a stunning reversal of fortune, he was summoned to the capital in mid-1996 by Pavel Borodin, the powerful Kremlin property manager, and offered a mid-level post in the Presidential Property Management Department. By 1997, he was deputy head of the Kremlin's main control directorate, auditing regional governors. In 1998, President Boris Yeltsin, ailing and besieged, appointed him head of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, the domestic successor to the KGB. Putin had returned home. He moved swiftly to consolidate the FSB, purging rivals, promoting loyalists from his St. Petersburg and Dresden days, and restoring the morale and influence of the security services. He presented himself not as a politician, but as a disciplined, no-nonsense Chekist, security officer who could bring order. Yeltsin's inner circle, the family, was desperately seeking a successor, a man who could win an election, guarantee their immunity from prosecution for the rampant corruption of the 1990s, and protect their vast fortunes. They needed someone competent enough to be credible, but dependent enough to be controlled. The seemingly colorless bureaucrat fit the bill perfectly. In March 1999, Yeltsin appointed him Secretary of the Security Council. In August 1999, in a move that shocked the political establishment, Yeltsin named Putin Prime Minister, the fifth in less than 2 years. The stage was set for what appeared to be another transient figure in Russia's chaotic politics. Then, history handed Putin his defining crisis. In September 1999, a series of deadly apartment bombings in Moscow and other cities killed over 300 civilians. The government, with Putin now at the helm of its response, immediately blamed Chechen separatists. The public, terrified and enraged, demanded a strong hand. Putin's response was brutally decisive and perfectly attuned to the national mood. In a famous televised quote, he vowed to pursue the terrorists everywhere. "If we catch them in the toilet, we will waste them in the outhouse," he declared with cold fury. He launched a massive second Chechen war, contrasting his grim resolve with Yeltsin's perceived weakness during the first Chechen debacle. State-controlled media portrayed him as the nation's savior, a tough, action-oriented leader, restoring Russian pride and security. His approval ratings skyrocketed from single digits to over 70% in a matter of weeks. On December 31, 1999, in a move that forever altered Russian history, Boris Yeltsin appeared on television to announce his immediate resignation. Russia must enter the new millennium with new politicians, new faces, new intelligent, strong, and energetic people, he said. As acting president, in accordance with the Constitution, was Vladimir Putin. Yeltsin asked for forgiveness for the failures of the 1990s, and in his first act as Russia's leader, Putin signed a decree guaranteeing Yeltsin and his family full immunity from prosecution. The transfer of power and the Protection Pact was complete. The election on March 26, 2000, was a formality. Putin won in the first round with 53% of the vote. His campaign was a masterpiece of vague but potent messaging. He promised a dictatorship of law, a concept that appealed to those yearning for order but wary of a return to Soviet-style totalitarianism. He spoke of restoring the vertical of power, reasserting Moscow's control over the restive regions and oligarchs who had run wild during the Yeltsin years. He presented himself as a modernizer, a pragmatist, and above all, a derzhavnik, a proponent of a strong, sovereign Russian state. To a population exhausted by a decade of chaos, decline, and international disrespect, he was not just a candidate, he was a remedy. On May 7, 2000, Vladimir Putin walked into the Grand Kremlin Palace for his inauguration. The spy who had watched his world disintegrate in Dresden a decade earlier now stood at the apex of the state he had once served from the shadows. The chaos of the 1990s was the anvil upon which his political identity was forged. He had not created that chaos, but he had studied its every contour, built alliances within it, and ultimately offered himself as the only force capable of ending it. The question that hung in the air as he took the presidential oath was not whether he would consolidate power, but how far he would go to ensure that the chaos and the humiliating weakness it symbolized would never return. Vladimir Putin's inauguration in May 2000 marked the beginning of a cold, systematic revolution, a revolution from above, designed not to empower the people, but to disarm every competing center of authority and reconcentrate absolute power within the walls of the Kremlin. The Russia he inherited was a fragmented, post-imperial space where regional warlords, billionaire oligarchs, and independent media magnates often wielded more influence than the central government. Putin's core project, drawn from his KGB worldview, was the restoration of the Gossudarственность, the power and prestige of the state. This chapter meticulously chronicles the first pivotal term of his presidency, a period of ruthless institutional engineering where he constructed the infamous vertical of power, neutralized rival elites, and transformed Russia's political system from a chaotic, nascent democracy into a highly centralized, managed authoritarian regime. We examine the four key fronts of this consolidation: the taming of the oligarchs, the subjugation of the regions, the capture of the media, and the rise of the Siloviki, security service elites, as the new ruling caste. Putin's first and most symbolic targets were the oligarchs, the small group of businessmen who, during the anarchic privatizations of the 1990s, had seized control of Russia's vast natural resource and industrial empires. They were not just wealthy, they were political kingmakers, funding parties, controlling television channels, and influencing policy to protect their interests. Within months of taking office, Putin convened a historic meeting with roughly 24 of the most powerful tycoons. The message was delivered with characteristic bluntness. They could retain their fortunes, but they must relinquish their political ambitions. This was the new Kremlin Pact: economic freedom in exchange for political obedience. Pragmatists like Roman Abramovich and Mikhail Friedman understood the new reality and retreated from the political spotlight. However, two figures, Boris Berezovsky, who controlled the major channel, ORT, and Vladimir Gusinsky, owner of the independent NTV network, defied the warning. They represented the old model of oligarchic power, where media ownership translated directly into political leverage. Putin's response was a masterclass in leveraging state machinery for political vendettas. Using the Prosecutor General's office and the tax police, the state launched aggressive investigations into their company's finances. Berezovsky, facing arrest, fled to London in late 2000, where he later died in exile. Gusinsky was arrested and briefly jailed before being coerced to selling his media-most holding, including NTV, to the state-controlled gas monopoly Gazprom. The takeaway was unambiguous and terrifying to the elite. The era of independent political power outside the Kremlin's control was irrevocably over. Wealth was permissible only under the condition of absolute loyalty. Simultaneously, Putin moved to dismantle the parade of sovereignties, the tendency of Russia's 89 regional governors to act as local autocrats, often ignoring federal law and withholding tax revenues. In May 2000, he issued a decree establishing 7 new federal districts, each overseen by a presidential envoy. These envoys, almost exclusively former generals or high-ranking Siloviki personally loyal to Putin, were granted vast supervisory powers to enforce Moscow's will. Later that year, he orchestrated a reform of the Federation Council, the upper house of parliament. Previously composed of sitting governors and regional legislative speakers, it was now filled with their appointed representatives, stripping the governors of parliamentary immunity and a powerful national platform. The most dramatic centralization followed the horrific Beslan school siege in September 2004. Citing the need for stronger anti-terror coordination, Putin pushed through a law abolishing the direct popular election of governors. Henceforth, the president would nominate candidates whom regional legislatures would approve. This single move transformed governors from elected representatives into appointed bureaucrats in a rigid hierarchy, their careers wholly dependent on presidential favor. The vertical of power was no longer a metaphor, it was the operational principle of the Russian state, a rigid chain of command stretching from the Kremlin to the remotest village. The third critical front was the information space. A free and critical press was incompatible with a centralized power vertical. The takeover of Gusinsky's NTV was just the opening act. Throughout Putin's first term, the state or state-friendly entities like Gazprom and Rosneft acquired controlling stakes in all major national television networks, Channel 1, Rossiya, and the now tamed NTV. Television, watched by the overwhelming majority of Russians for news, was converted into a potent tool for engineering consent. News broadcasts became meticulously curated spectacles, framing Putin as the indispensable national leader, a restorer of order, a modernizer, and a defiant defender of Russian interests abroad. Investigative journalism into high-level corruption or criticism of the president's core policies vanished from the airwaves. Dissenting voices were marginalized to low-circulation newspapers, fringe radio stations, and the then niche internet. The goal was not merely censorship, but the creation of a new unifying narrative. The chaotic and humiliating 1990s were caused by weak leadership and foreign plots. Stability, strength, and national pride had been restored by Vladimir Putin. This control of reality itself became a cornerstone of his power. Underpinning and enabling these political, economic, and media transformations was a silent sociological revolution, the rise of the Siloviki. These were men, like Putin, whose careers were forged in the Soviet and Russian security services, the KGB, FSB, GRU, military intelligence, and interior ministries. They shared a common worldview that prioritized state security, secrecy, hierarchy, and suspicion of the West above all else. As Putin consolidated power, he systematically placed these loyalists in key positions not only within the traditional power ministries, but across the government, state corporations, and regional administrations. The FSB, in particular, saw its budget, personnel, and mandate expand dramatically. It became the ultimate arbiter of political and business disputes, a shadowy guarantor of the regime's stability. This securitization of the state meant that the methods of intelligence work, compartmentalization, surveillance, the collection of compromat, and covert action became the methods of governance. The state was no longer a public service, it was a fortress, guarded by a closed, paranoid, and immensely powerful caste whose primary allegiance was to their patron and the system he built. By the time Putin stood for re-election in March 2004, the transformation was complete. The oligarchs were subdued, the regions silenced, the media harnessed, and the security services ascendant. His approval ratings, buoyed by a surging economy fueled by rising oil prices and a newfound sense of stability, hovered near 80%. The election itself was a coronation. He won in the first round with 71.3% of the vote against token opposition. The chaotic, competitive, and uncertain politics of the 1990s were decisively buried. In their place stood a new system, stable, predictable, and centralized. It was a system that traded political freedoms for a promise of order and critical debate for a curated national story. Putin had not just won an election, he had rebuilt the Russian state in his own image. The next phase would test the limits of this restored state, both in confronting pockets of internal dissent and in projecting its newfound confidence onto an increasingly skeptical world stage. With the domestic vertical of power firmly cemented by 2004, Vladimir Putin turned his focus outward. The second phase of his rule, spanning his second term, 2004 to 2008, and his stint as prime minister, 2008 to 2012, was defined by an increasingly assertive and often confrontational foreign policy, driven by a profound desire to reverse the humiliations of the 1990s and re-establish Russia as an indispensable global power. This period witnessed the first use of large-scale military force beyond Russia's borders in the post-Soviet space, the weaponization of energy resources for political leverage, and the articulation of a worldview that directly challenged the US-led liberal international order. Simultaneously, it saw the orchestration of an unprecedented political maneuver, the castling move with Dmitry Medvedev, that allowed Putin to circumvent constitutional term limits while retaining de facto control. This chapter analyzes how Putin's Russia shifted from internal consolidation to external projection, testing the boundaries of the post-Cold War world and laying the ideological and strategic groundwork for the more aggressive interventions that would follow. The ideological foundation for this assertive turn was laid in a seminal speech. In February 2007, Putin took the stage at the Munich Security Conference, an annual gathering of Western defense and diplomatic elites. His address was a blistering, uncompromising indictment of the United States and its allies. He denounced the US-led unipolar world as not only unacceptable, but also inherently unstable. He condemned NATO's eastward expansion as a serious provocation that reduced mutual trust, criticized American unilateralism, and lambasted the West's promotion of so-called democratic revolutions in sovereign states. For Western audiences, it was a shocking rupture from diplomatic niceties. For Putin and the Russian security establishment, it was a long overdue declaration of independence, a statement that Russia would no longer be a passive object in a Western-designed system, but an active subject with its own interests, red lines, and sphere of influence. Munich 2007 marked Russia's ideological return to great power competition. This rhetoric was backed by potent economic and geopolitical tools. As global oil and gas prices soared throughout the 2000s, filling Russia's coffers, Putin transformed the country's vast energy reserves into instruments of state power. This was exemplified in the gas wars with Ukraine in 2006 and 2009. Russia abruptly cut off natural gas supplies to Ukraine, which also affected transit to Europe, during price and debt disputes. While framed as commercial disagreements, these actions sent a clear political message. Former Soviet states seeking closer integration with the West, particularly NATO or EU, would face tangible economic and security costs. Europe's dependency on Russian gas was laid bare, creating deep divisions within the EU between member states seeking to diversify energy sources and those prioritizing pragmatic engagement with Moscow. The message was one of coercive diplomacy. Energy was not just a commodity, but a lever to punish adversaries, reward allies, and maintain strategic influence over the near abroad. The most dramatic manifestation of this new assertiveness came in August 2008 with the Russo-Georgian War. Tensions had been simmering for years over Georgia's pro-Western trajectory under President Mikhail Saakashvili and the status of the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which were backed by Russian peacekeepers and where most residents held Russian passports. On the night of August 7th, following escalating skirmishes, Saakashvili ordered a major military offensive to retake South Ossetia. Putin, attending the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony, swiftly authorized a massive counterattack. Russian forces not only pushed Georgian troops out of South Ossetia, but also launched a deep invasion into Georgia proper, threatening the capital, Tbilisi. The 5-day war ended with an EU-brokered ceasefire, but the strategic outcomes were decisively in Russia's favor. Georgia's military was crippled, its NATO aspirations were effectively frozen, and Russia formally recognized the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The war demonstrated several key Putin doctrines. Russia would use overwhelming military force to defend its declared sphere of influence. It would exploit the vulnerabilities of post-Soviet states with ethnic conflicts, and it calculated, correctly, that the West's response would be limited to strong rhetoric, not direct military confrontation. It was a watershed, the first time since the Soviet collapse that Russia had redrawn international borders by force, signaling that the post-Cold War settlement in Eurasia was now negotiable at the barrel of a gun. While projecting strength abroad, Putin faced a novel domestic constraint, the Russian constitution's 2-term limit. As 2008 approached, he could not run for a third consecutive term. His solution was an elaborate political ballet that preserved his paramount authority while adhering to the letter of the law. He selected Dmitry Medvedev, a loyal, young, and seemingly liberal technocrat who had been his chief of staff and chairman of Gazprom, as his successor. In March 2008, with the state's full administrative and media resources behind him, Medvedev won easily. Putin then seamlessly moved into the post of prime minister, a position he significantly empowered. The tandemocracy was born. While Medvedev was the nominal president and spoke a language of modernization, resetting relations with the West, and technological innovation, the ultimate levers of power, particularly over the security services, defense, and major strategic industries, remained firmly in Putin's hands. The castling move proved the system was not built around institutions, but around one man. It also showcased Putin's confidence in his control. He could temporarily step sideways without any real risk of his authority being challenged from within. The Medvedev interlude, 2008 to 2012, saw a partial tactical thaw with the West, notably the reset with the Obama administration, which yielded the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty. However, core disagreements over missile defense and NATO remained. Domestically, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis exposed the fragility of Russia's oil-dependent economy, leading to a sharp recession and protests over unemployment. The regime responded with increased social spending to maintain stability. As Medvedev's term neared the end, the question of 2012 loomed. In September 2011, Putin announced at a United Party Congress that he and Medvedev had long ago agreed that Putin would return to the presidency. The orchestrated swap was confirmed. The announcement, perceived as arrogant and dismissive of popular choice, triggered the largest anti-government protests in Moscow since the 1990s, following disputed parliamentary elections in December 2011. Tens of thousands of mostly urban, educated middle-class Russians took to the streets chanting, "Russia without Putin." The protests shocked the Kremlin, revealing a growing disillusionment among a segment of the population not bought off by stability and rising incomes. Putin's response was twofold: a fierce crackdown, with arrests and new laws severely restricting public assembly and branding NGOs receiving foreign funding as foreign agents, and a recalibration of his populist appeal, framing himself as the defender of a conservative, traditional Russian majority against a Western-funded urban liberal minority. In March 2012, amid widespread allegations of electoral fraud, Putin was elected to a third presidential term. He returned to the Kremlin not just as a leader, but as a besieged fortress commander, his worldview hardened by protest and his determination to secure the regime against internal and external threats, now absolute. The stage was set for an even more confrontational and isolationist chapter. Vladimir Putin's return to the presidency in 2012 marked a definitive pivot. Gone was the tentative reset of the Medvedev years. In its place emerged a Russia willing to undertake high-risk, high-reward military interventions to reshape geopolitical realities and defend its regime from perceived existential threats. This phase, from 2012 through the late 2010s, is defined by two landmark military campaigns, the annexation of Crimea and the intervention in Syria, and a deepening ideological confrontation with the West that was framed as a civilizational struggle. Domestically, it saw the consolidation of a fortress Russia mentality, where external confrontation was used to justify internal repression, economic hardship was blamed on foreign enemies, and Putin's leadership was portrayed as the only bulwark against chaos. This chapter examines how Putin, facing growing domestic discontent and a West he viewed as expansionist and hypocritical, chose strategic offense as his best defense, redrawing the map of Europe and re-establishing Russia as a global military power player. The trigger for the most dramatic geopolitical event in post-Cold War Europe was the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine. In late 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, under intense pressure from Moscow, abruptly rejected an association agreement with the European Union, sparking massive pro-European anti-corruption protests in Kyiv's Independence Square. The protests grew, turning violent, and in February 2014, Yanukovych fled to Russia. Putin and his Security Council viewed these events not as a popular uprising, but as a Western-orchestrated fascist coup that overthrew a legitimate, if corrupt, ally. The prospect of a fiercely pro-Western government taking power in Kyiv, a historic core of Russian civilization and a critical strategic buffer, was an unacceptable red line. Putin's response was swift, daring, and executed with a hybrid warfare playbook that would become known as the Gerasimov Doctrine. Though named for a Russian general, its principles were on full display. In late February 2014, unmarked soldiers, dubbed Little Green Men, seized key infrastructure in Crimea. They were Russian special forces without insignia, enabling Putin to deny direct involvement with a smirk, asking, "You think they came from Mars?" A hastily organized referendum, held under military occupation and denounced internationally as illegitimate, reported 97% support for joining Russia. On March 18, 2014, Putin gave a historic speech to a joint session of the Russian parliament, passionately arguing that Crimea had always been Russian and that its return rectified a historic injustice perpetrated by Soviet leaders. He then signed the Treaty of Annexation. The annexation of Crimea was a masterstroke in Putin's calculus. It achieved multiple objectives with minimal conventional military cost. It secured Russia's strategically vital Black Sea Fleet base in Sevastopol permanently. It delivered a massive patriotic victory at home, sending Putin's approval ratings to record highs, a phenomenon dubbed the Crimean Consensus that drowned out the economic grievances of 2011-2012. It demonstrated a ruthless willingness to violate international law and alter borders by force, shocking Europe and exposing the impotence of Western guarantees to Ukraine. The subsequent covert Russian instigation of a separatist war in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region further destabilized the country, preventing it from consolidating as a successful pro-Western state and keeping it in a frozen conflict that gave Moscow a permanent lever of influence. The West responded with escalating economic sanctions, targeting key Russian officials, oligarchs, and sectors like finance and energy technology. These sanctions, combined with a concurrent collapse in global oil prices, plunged Russia into a severe recession in 2015-2016. Putin, however, turned this hardship into a virtue domestically, promoting a narrative of besiegement and rallying the population around the need for patriotic resilience and import substitution, importsamashenia. Not content with revising the European order, Putin then shocked the world by intervening decisively in the Syrian civil war in September 2015. While the West was bogged down in indecision and half-measures, Russia launched a massive air campaign at the formal request of its beleaguered ally, President Bashar Assad. Officially, the goal was to combat terrorism, namely ISIS. In reality, the overwhelming majority of Russian airstrikes targeted other Assad opposition groups, including those backed by the West, saving the regime from collapse. The intervention was a geopolitical game-changer. It showcased Russia's modernized military capabilities and its willingness to project power far beyond its immediate neighborhood. It re-established Russia as an indispensable Middle East power broker, forcing the U.S. to engage with it as a co-equal in diplomatic processes. It provided a live-fire testing ground for Russian weapons and tactics, and it created a migrant crisis in Europe that further strained Western unity and institutions. Syria became the ultimate demonstration of Putin's core foreign policy principle. In a world where the U.S. is reluctant to commit ground troops, a determined regional power with a clear objective and a willingness to use force ruthlessly can achieve decisive results. This external assertiveness was mirrored by an intensified ideological and informational war with the West. The Kremlin's media apparatus, now including sophisticated international outlets like RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik, promoted a worldview of civilizational conflict. It portrayed the West as decadent, morally bankrupt, and aggressively seeking to impose its liberal values, LGBTQ+ rights, multiculturalism, on traditional societies like Russia through color revolutions. This narrative positioned Putin as the defender of conservative, Christian, traditional values against a godless globalist elite, a message that resonated with far-right and populist movements across Europe and America, undermining Western political cohesion. This weaponization of information sought not necessarily to convince audiences that Russia was good, but that the West was hypocritical and corrupt, that truth was relative, and that no political model was superior. Cyber operations, like the hacking of the Democratic National Committee in the 2016 U.S. election, further blurred the lines between peace and conflict, demonstrating Russia's ability to sow discord and challenge democratic processes within its adversaries' own borders. By the end of the 2010s, the Putin system had fully matured. It was a unique synthesis, a personalist authoritarian regime underpinned by a powerful security state, sustained by hydrocarbon revenues, legitimized by a nationalist and conservative ideology, and secured through constant, managed conflict with an external enemy. The fortress was complete. The social contract had been rewritten. The state no longer promised a better future through liberal reforms, but security, stability, and national pride in defiance of a hostile world. Economic stagnation was framed as the cost of sovereignty. Political freedoms were sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical strength. As Putin prepared for the constitutional changes of 2020 that would allow him to remain in power potentially until 2036, the system faced one ultimate test. Could this fortress withstand the internal pressures of a stagnant economy, a disillusioned younger generation, and the inevitable question of succession? And how far would its defender go to preempt any threat, external or internal, to the order he had spent 2 decades building? The final chapter of this story was yet to be written, but its trajectory was clear. Consolidation at home demanded confrontation abroad, and the preservation of power justified any means. As Vladimir Putin's rule stretched into its 3rd decade, the political system he engineered transcended mere governance to become a self-sustaining ecosystem, System Putin. This final chapter examines the nature of this system in its mature phase, its mechanisms of perpetual rule, its economic and social foundations. the cult of personality that sustains it, and the profound, unanswered questions about its long-term stability and ultimate legacy. We analyze the 2020 constitutional reset, the domestic fallout from the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and the paradox of a regime that appears simultaneously unshakable and brittle. This is the story of a leader who sought to end Russian history's cycle of chaos by making himself its permanent author, and the world he has made in the process. The most glaring architectural feature of System Putin is its explicit design for leader perpetuation. The pivotal moment came in January 2020, when Putin, during his annual address to the Federal Assembly, proposed sweeping constitutional changes. Ostensibly about rebalancing power between branches of government, the amendments contained a crucial provision, resetting presidential term limits to 0, allowing him to run for 2 more 6-year terms after his current one ended in 2024. A nationwide vote in July 2020, criticized by observers for lacking transparency, approved the changes. This move, following the earlier castling with Medvedev, removed the last fig leaf of institutional constraint. The presidency was no longer an office with term limits. For Putin, it had become a lifelong appointment. The system is built on a complex, pyramid-like structure of loyalty and control. At its apex stands Putin himself, the ultimate arbiter among competing clans of Siloviki, technocrats, and business elites. Beneath him, a vast bureaucracy and security apparatus ensure control, while a curated political landscape featuring a dominant party, United Russia, and systemic opposition parties that critique policy but not the president's supremacy, creates a simulacrum of political competition. The goal is not dynamism, but stasis, the prevention of any unforeseen change that could threaten the hierarchy. Economically, the system operates as a form of state capitalism with distinct kleptocratic characteristics. The state, through giants like Rosneft, oil, and Gazprom, gas, controls the commanding heights of the energy sector, which funds the budget. Loyal oligarchs manage vast empires, but understand their holdings are contingent on obedience. Corruption is not a bug, but a feature, a mechanism of control, where the state selectively enforces laws to reward allies and punish challengers. This created a social contract for much of the 2000s and early 2010s. The population traded political freedoms for stability and steadily improving living standards, fueled by high commodity prices. However, since the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the imposition of Western sanctions, the economy has stagnated. Real incomes have declined or plateaued for most of the decade. The system's response has been a turn to greater autarky, import substitution, increased military and security spending, and reliance on sovereign wealth funds to smooth over crises. The contract is evolving from prosperity for passivity to patriotism for patience, where hardship is framed as sacrifice for national sovereignty. Culturally and ideologically, Putin has overseen the construction of a new Russian identity. This identity is built on several pillars. 1. Historical revisionism, glorifying the Soviet victory in World War II, the Great Patriotic War, as the foundational myth of state power, while downlining Stalinist terror. 2. Conservative morality, positioning Russia as the defender of traditional values against a decadent liberal West, exemplified by laws against gay propaganda. 3. Nationalist grievance, nurturing the narrative that the West has never accepted a strong Russia and seeks to keep it weak, making external confrontation inevitable and justifying internal unity under a strong leader. The Orthodox Church has become a key partner in this project, lending divine sanction to the state. This ideology is propagated through a completely controlled national media, which functions as the system's central nervous system, manufacturing consent and defining reality for the majority. The system's ultimate stress test, and potentially its defining legacy, began on February 24th with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The decision, likely taken by a small, isolated circle, revealed the potential for catastrophic miscalculation at the heart of personalized rule. The war has had seismic consequences. Militarily, it has resulted in huge losses, revealing weaknesses in a military modernization program long hyped by state media. Economically, it triggered the most severe sanctions in history, severing Russia from much of the global financial and technological system, leading to a long-term trajectory of economic decline relative to the West. Socially, it triggered the largest exodus of educated professionals since the 1917 revolution and intensified repression under new wartime censorship laws. Geopolitically, it turned Russia into a pariah state for the West and pushed it into a deep, dependent alliance with China. Yet within the fortress, the system has demonstrated a grim resilience. The state has doubled down on repression, crushing the last vestiges of dissent, labeling anti-war critics as traitors, and forcing independent media and NGOs to close or flee. The economy, though wounded, has not collapsed, stabilized by high energy prices, wartime stimulus, and a pivot to Asian markets. For a significant portion of the population, state propaganda has been effective in framing the war as an existential struggle against NATO. However, the war has also exposed the system's fatal flaw, its complete dependence on one man's judgment and its inability to correct course without him. There is no mechanism for a palace coup or a managed succession that doesn't risk unleashing the very chaos the system was built to prevent. As of now, Vladimir Putin's legacy is a tragic paradox. He stabilized a failing state and restored its international standing, but at the cost of making it an authoritarian, revisionist power locked in conflict with its neighbors and the West. He created a system of remarkable internal stability, but one that is rigid, corrupt, and potentially brittle in the face of long-term economic stagnation and the ultimate and inevitable question of his departure. He gave Russians pride, but took away their future. The final chapter of the Putin era remains unwritten. It will be determined by the outcome of the war in Ukraine, the durability of the sanctions regime, and the system's ability to manage the ultimate succession. What is certain is that he has already reshaped Russia and the world. He proved that history, which he believed had ended for Russia in the 1990s, could be restarted, not with liberal democracy, but with the age-old tools of fear, national pride, and the relentless, patient will to power. The spy from Leningrad did not just become president, he sought to become the definition of Russia itself, for as long as he and the system that bears his name could endure.